I think one of the things that I would, give advice to a younger self or to someone who's starting out is don't be afraid to take risks. Don't be afraid to fail. That's how we learn. And you need to be open to challenges. Figure out if you like doing the stuff. Get exposure to the area that you're working with. And as you're working with that group or environment, the other thing I would tell people is find a mentor.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Miriam Morales, for joining us here today. She's a data scientist, as well as a director of data analytics, as well as a biostatistician and an epidemiologist. Dr. Morales has spent over 20 years helping executives navigate analytics products and delivering actionable insights to help improve patient outcomes. Over and above her corporate influences, she has also helped manage $11 million in USDA funds and NIH studies in children's nutrition, children's neuroscience, and children's neurosurgery. And these studies, in addition to that, she's also got an endowment scholarship named after her. So thank you so much, Dr. Miriam Morales, for joining us here today.
Thank you, Ian, for inviting me. I am honored to be here and share my experiences with your audience.
Yeah, perfect. Well, so we've had some earlier conversations, and one of the things that intrigued me the most about you was just our conversations in developing a data culture. And you're going to have this tagline from data consumers to data citizens, protecting the ecosystem of data, right? And as we kind of think about it, like imagine like finance trying to make a organization finance centric, right? But we try to do that from the data teams. So can you help us break down what you mean by that tagline and how to kind of create a culture, a data culture within an organization?
Sure. So, whenever you're trying to set up a data culture, you're trying to cultivate a data culture, your ultimate aim or goal there that we touched upon is to empower your data consumers to become data citizens. And that's going to help them have an ability to safeguard their organization's data ecosystem. And for that transformation to happen, you need about three basic pillars. You need to be able to foster an environment of data driven decision making, be able to invest in training of critical skills, and you have to be able to ensure you have a seamless integration across daily decision making processes. And have a scenario or an example that I like, a little story that I can share with you. So, for example, you're summoned to this very important meeting. It's a pivotal meeting in your organization, and you want to determine the next critical capital investment. Stakes are high. That decision can change the shape or the future of your organization. And you come into the boardroom, the meeting area, and you have a lot of animated discussion, and there's a lot of really good energy in the room. And it's your turn to present. And you unveil this wonderful presentation. You've meticulously prepared your pitch, you have verified data and very compelling visualizations. But the audience is just looking at you with these blank stares. And this has happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to other members in the audience. It's a familiar scenario,
Right.
and
Yeah,
and
we've all probably pretty much gone through just the dead stare of just like, uh-huh. Are you
yeah,
done yet?
and what do you do? Because you want to be able to deliver actionable information to your audience, but the root cause is not just necessarily, that part of it, but the disconnect is going to be that absence of one, two, or all three of those pillars, whether or not they're used to having data and using data to drive decisions, whether they may have the training or the flexibility or the familiarity to flex those critical thinking skills, and having the practice to be able to integrate that in their day-to-day decision making. And if any one of those elements is missing from your data culture, you're going to run into that kind of blank stare scenario over and over again.
Right. So ultimately the goal is kind of like I used finances as that example, right? Is that when they're making that decision, cost is always top of mind for almost every business person. And you're saying when we create those proper pillars, we're going to get it to where they're actually also thinking data as a consequence or a core decision making factor, right? So
Right. It's not just a graph or a key or a KPI. It's how do I use this data? How do I critically evaluate this information to make a data-driven decision? And how do I get comfortable doing that on a day-to-day basis so that you're flexing that normal part of that muscle or that skill and you're flexing it kind of almost naturally. And that's a culture development. It takes time. There's several key pieces that you want to invest in over time to be able to do that.
So what are help us out? What are some of those core investments where you're actually dedicating time to train that within the organization? What are some pieces that you personally have identified that you do and you try to establish at the organizations that you're at?
I think first and foremost, where I've seen a lot of organizations fail is that they just start off with a mandate. And they say now we're going to be data driven, and it's a
Right.
mandate. And but that alone in itself is not going to make you be a data driven organization. On the back end of that, your executives need to be modeling that behavior. A good example that I've seen is where your C suite or your CEOs are doing that with the data that they're presenting. So, whether it's a finance example, whether it's an external benchmark in healthcare, because that's what I'm used to looking at. When those leaders are pointing to that data, they're using that data, they're speaking to it, they're able to understand and articulate and contextualize it. That's the first part. So it's not just a mandate, but your leaders are actually using, speaking, talking about that data on a regular basis. And that's just one part of it. The
Got
other
it. So
part,
you're going to have like a top-down colloquialism of data. So
yeah.
if the leadership's using data as the foundation of their verbiage and how they're actually speaking and making decisions, then you're saying likewise everyone underneath them is going to feel obligated in some sense of the words to be able to speak competently, right? Like if they want to speak on the same level as their leaders, they're going to be using those same colloquialisms. Is that a good way of summarizing what you're saying?
That's a good way to start summarizing, yes. And at the same time, that top down approach has to have scaffolding, right? You need to have the infrastructure or the communication or the ability to communicate and potentially fail when you're communicating, all the way down to that financial analyst, that revenue analyst, the bedside nurse. Because if it's just at the top and it's just we're just talking about it without actually breaking it down all the way down to the person who's going to need to affect change or behavior differently in the organization, then you're still just kind of superficial having a data driven policy.
Right. So you're saying that we need to have analytics available using a governing data language, so like some form of a data dictionary that's ubiquitous, and then having analytics necessary across from the janitor all the way up to the executive. So if you just build out only executive dashboards and only executive insights, then they'll use it, but then nobody else has the ability to actually communicate on that level. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and you don't even have potentially any incentive to do it. Every single person has their regular day-to-day job to do.
Right.
And then now we're going to say, oh, now you got to use data. Well, you can't just like snap your fingers and now people are doing it. We have to foster or model that behavior, the critical skills that I was referencing earlier about investing in training and education for access, using the information, speaking to the information, contextualizing it. But
Right.
you have to translate it, right? Your C-suite CFO is going to speak about it one way. Your mid-level managers will use that data one way. Your bedside nurse, your financial analyst is going to interpret what they need to do on a day to day differently. And if it stays at that micro level without getting translated all the way down, you're not going to have enough momentum or utilization of that information to affect the change that you want to see at the end of the day.
So, was there any other key kind of points that you were saying that needs to be done in order to create that organizational adoption of data culture?
I think one of the parts that we talked about is the data literacy and investing in those specific training of critical skills. And what I've seen different organizations do is they say, we're just going to have a data literacy program. We'll put it in our education platform and tell everybody to go take these classes. But you have to go and meet people where they are today. We're a very data rich society, but we are not necessarily used to using it to make decisions or even speak about or translate in your day-to-day work. So when you're thinking about how do I translate that, you need to know how are they discussing data today, and they may not be discussing data the way us as data nerds or people who
Right,
are used to looking at information think about, because we get in our little box with our blinders of what this data is, and we lose connection of downstream. How does that person at the very end downstream use or think about data? We have to translate it to that person so then they can affect it and internalize it and impact the behavior change that you want to see in the aggregate, all the way from the macro to the macro level. If you're
right.
not translating it along those pieces, your overall cumulative investment is going to be a shortfall. You won't be able to reach the people that you need to change the behaviors that you want to have to impact that KPI at the end of the day.
And so what you're speaking about is like data contextualization, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
how do you do that? Like, let's just say you took a
Okay.
billing analyst, right? Like give me an idea as to how do I like frame the culture at an organization in such a way that the billing analyst has the data that they interact with, the data that they use, fully contextualized to their role, and so that
Right.
way it can be a practice that's kind of um, the soft skill that's applied unilaterally up and down the organization.
Right, right. So the example I have, the little story that I have is related to healthcare. It's related to, say, a bedside nurse, but you can translate it to your financial analyst scenario. So I had a situation where I was called into two different organizations to change their national ranking. And the results are public and it's very high stakes because you don't want to lose your footprint or your market share. And simply sharing those results is not enough. It's not going to just change your outcomes. You have to be putting those into their day to day processes and workflows. So, say, for example, whether it's a nurse or a financial analyst, you have your regular day to day job of reports, of patient care, of things that you have to do. And you're not going to care about a specific data literacy program or KPI that you have to do until you put it into their day to day workflow. What decisions does that financial analyst or that nurse have to make every day about the reports that they're doing, about the patient care that they're touching, and make it translate to how do I keep this wound clean? How do I take care of bundling of infection and prevention information? How do I do that even though I'm managing 5 or 6 or 7 patients at the same time? So
Right.
access down to where it's not an additional burden that they have to have too many clicks or things to do, and translating the language. So, specific to a nurse, specific to a financial analyst, specific to
Right.
that person or that role, where they're not going to feel like, oh, I have to learn a whole bunch of new different things, or that it makes sense and that it's easy for them to go after and do that. And organizations that are successful at breaking it all the way down can quickly change those long-term outcomes and improve national rank standings. And I've seen that happen where they've kept it very high level. They didn't share it, they didn't translate it, they didn't impact their outcomes or their rank. The organizations that are pivoting and translating it all the way down, their cumulative rankings and public information are improving, and sometimes really quickly if they're nimble enough to be able to respond to their employees' feedback about what makes sense to them on their day to day workflow.
Got it. So what you're almost using or saying is kind of like if we were to use kind of dialects or even just using kind of like accents, right? So if you took like the southern or the northern or the New Yorker accent, right, and you just said, okay, like within an organization, you have to kind of bring in that dialect of that specific role and allow the data definitions to be supporting and merged into what they're already doing. Am I understanding that properly?
Yeah, and it's a combination of meeting them where they are. What is
Okay,
it that that person is challenged with on a day-to-day basis? Make that easier for them, and then you can weave in the data literacy, decision
right,
making, and it's easier for them. And you're going to have to change it. It's not like, a recipe that you can with the same bag of ingredients you can do over and over again. You're going to have to flex, and that's
got
where
it.
I've seen, yeah, organizations that were successful, they can flex it.
Got
And
it.
you're,
So you have
you
to
can.
solve some problem that's already painful for them. And then
Mhm.
as they do, they're naturally and organically going to adopt um, the data terminology that made their life easier. Is that right?
Yeah, they won't even know that it's happening. They
Right,
won't even know that it's happening because you didn't frame it as a data literacy program. You framed it as, hey, you need help managing, your work list. Hey, you need help not having to recreate the same set of data over and over
right.
again. Hey, you need help with a particular SQL code skill set. What is it and how do I frame it so that's relevant to you? But in the long term, it's going to impact that cumulative behavior that I want to see change for the organization.
Got it. So
Mhm.
obviously, this is going to take. Um, this is not something one person can do. So you're going to have to. You have to not only train the organization, but you have to start internally with your team, right? And
Mhm.
train them in these methodologies and approaches to how to curate an environment where they are then exercising and practicing this throughout the organization.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, what have you found to help teach that soft skill to some of your teams, so that way they are then on in turn pushing it out to the rest of the organization?
I think the biggest way to help with that soft skill is by modeling it yourself. I'm the one here showing, sitting down next to you. I'm willing to hear what it looks like for you, and modeling that behavior, that communication, and also thinking through that not everyone learns the same way as you do or I
Right.
do. You have your kinesthetic, hands-on. You have your visual learners. You have learners that like to read a book. So offering the different ways for the users to interact with that information and letting them kind of organically get there over a specified timeline, and you coming in and saying, what questions did you have? How is that making sense for you or not? I think the other part that I started doing more recently, and I've seen a tremendous response from the team that I'm working with today, is how don't you've read this, you took this class, you did this thing on an online education platform, you read this book that I recommended to you, great, okay, fine. Articulate it back and apply it to a problem that you just tried to solve. And now that you are armed with this information, what would you have done differently?
Hmm.
That's the synthesis, the critical thinking skills that they're reflecting now on. Oh, okay. And then the next problem that comes is like, all right, what do we do differently compared to what we did 6 months ago, compared to what we did a year ago? And then slowly over time, those are then now the learning behaviors. It can be passive, it can be just one specific way or mode of education. And you have to engage their ability to synthesize and then reflect, and then start bringing that change into their current day-to-day workflow.
So first, it's like kind of like the traditional model of teaching. First, you demonstrate, and then you do it with them, with respected to their learning style, and then they should be off on their own to the races.
I mean, I'm not all the way by themselves, and your really good ones that are very eager and they want to model it and they want to go after it. Yeah, they can probably be off on the races right away. There's going to be some that you're going to have to hold their hands a little bit longer, or create that super user group forum that they can go to and ask questions as they're all learning at the same time.
So, how does creating this data culture actually kind of pair into or dovetail into data governance?
Yeah. So it's almost like what came first, like the chicken, the egg. What comes first, your data governance or your data culture? What comes first? and they kind of organically kind of go together almost, I think. But a lot of times I feel, or I've seen, where data governance comes out as a byproduct of data culture, and you may not even be framing it that way. And an example would be, you need the data culture communication platform, initiative, incentive that we're going to be working with. And because we're going to do that, there's going to be this conversation of, well, what do we need to do? And how do we set that up? And what are those guardrails going to look like? That's your data governance. May not be calling it data governance, but that's your data governance. And you get people talking about it on that road to data trust and saving everyone's time to consolidate and use, a single trusted, validated source of data. You weave in those components of education or training, framing it in the context or the taxonomy that they're referencing or they're used to. You capture your super users in that group. You capture your subject matter experts in that group. And that's how you get them hooked into that way of drinking the Kool-Aid from data culture to data governance. Along that pathway, you're developing some really good use case examples and success stories, and they hear about it and they see about it. And now they want the same kind of success. Oh, I want that ability to be able to make change and impact
Right.
change that way. How do I do that? Well, come to this, meeting or forum. You may not be using the words data governance or culture or literacy yet because your organization may not be there, or they had one and it left a bad taste in their mouth. And so they're like, you don't call it that. It doesn't matter what you call it. The goal or the intention is the same. You're getting people in the same room. They're talking about it. They want to learn how to improve and standardize and get there. And that's how you bring them into a data governance culture or set or framework, I think.
Got it. So, um, so if I mean, if I have to succinctly summarize this all together from like the establishing a data culture, establishing data literacy, um, it's going to be do, adding that value initially and speaking in their organic, normal, everyday life terms. And as you do that, you curate over time this desire and need and excitement about using data within the organization. Is that
Yeah, I would agree. And the way that you get them excited about it, right? Like, who's going to be excited about data? Like,
okay?
only us data nerds will be excited about
Right,
data. But you have a successful use case scenario like productivity, or a revenue example, or
right,
saving a contribution margin, or a waste reduction, or improving a patient's outcome or life. And that's the story that you frame, or the hook that you frame engagement around. How were they able to do that? And the whole thing that everything we've been talking about, trusted set of information, the literacy, the education, all of that is the framework that now you're able to have a successful use case story to bring people in, to draw them in, to want to learn more about.
awesome. So,
Mm.
uh, as we start to come to a close, one of the questions I would love to ask you, and I think some of the other listeners would love to hear from you, is you have a profoundly like well-established career, and you've been able to accomplish quite a number of amazing things. I mean, I don't know too many people that have a scholarship named after themselves. So, um,
Thank you.
what would be advice you would give to somebody who's starting from either not even in data, desiring to get into it, or even just early on in their career, how to move? Like, what are some core pieces of advice you would give to somebody if you were to kind of retrace your steps or redo this over again?
I think one of the things that I would, give advice to a younger self or to someone who's starting out is, don't be afraid to take risks. Don't be afraid to fail. That's how we learn. And you need to be open to challenges, to taking calculated risks where you learn and you also fail in a safe environment or way. And the best way to do that is while you're, in school and you get an internship, figure out if you like doing the stuff, get exposure to the area that you're working with, And as you're working with that group or environment, the other thing I would tell people is find a mentor.
Mm.
The mentor is not gonna magically appear on their own. You're gonna maybe have to find someone that you admire, how they communicate, how they talk, how they interact, and you're gonna go up to that person and start developing a relationship, interacting with them, networking with them, asking to be a mentee or a mentor. And even if that first person doesn't say yes, find someone else who will. So don't be afraid to take risks, calculated risks. Don't be afraid of failure. It's okay. Those are where you can have the best learning lessons of what to do differently, or even that maybe the path you were on was not necessarily 100% right. The failure actually helped you uncover some other additional insight. And looking
Right.
for a mentor and a sponsor and being that advocate for yourself to go do that, because it's not just going to magically show up for you.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's absolutely great. I mean, I think when I first started out my data career, I was actually pursuing getting into accountancy, right? And
Mhm.
and then I get this job offer for a business intelligence developer, and I said, well, what's that? You know? And I still was really unclear. Like I had no idea. And once I started getting into it, it was like, oh man, I really enjoy this. But I had to have this risk of like I'm moving my whole career trajectory because I got this offer and it seems like something I want to do, but I had no idea. And there's those
Yeah.
times where you just, or even just those projects that you work on, right? I love that. So,
Even, oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was going to say, you could be in an established role or work or whatever, and you want to expand on what data knowledge you have. The key differentiator I see is you only know one specific area, right? And you might not know that area really, really well. But if you're wanting to long term move up the organizational hierarchy to a higher level, director, president, vice president, CEO, you need to know more about the operational workflow of the organization and how to translate that to those different key stakeholders. And to do that, volunteer to work on a project that's on somebody else's team and
Yeah.
learn what are they doing and how do they think about data. Volunteer to be on a specific committee that's outside of what you normally do day to day. And you either like it or you won't, and that's okay. But if you're really wanting to move up the ladder, you have to know more about the entire book of business of the organization, not just your own portfolio of work.
Yeah, I absolutely love that last piece of advice because I think it's more than just the entry level person.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, no matter where you are in your career, you can easily go into another department, whatever that may be. Maybe it's marketing, maybe it's um, whatever that may be, right?
Mhm.
And you can go in there, find that business leader, and say, "Hey, look, I want to spend some extra hours. I want to develop my career in this capacity. Um, if I was to build something out for you, what would that look like? Can we partner with it? Partner together with it? It's got to be off the books because I'm working to do this on overtime hours, but I want to help deliver some value." I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, it puts you in a place where like nobody realizes you come in with this project that you've built out for the organization, and now you're one of the most indispensable people in the room, and I love
Yeah.
that.
And it
Like it,
really helps you flex your data translation skill,
yeah,
to other paradigms, to other business departments, to other units. I mean, I can talk with our CFO, I can talk with our CNO, our chief nursing officer, or our chief medical officer. I'm not a clinician and I'm not an accountant, but I've learned by working on projects with those teams what's meaningful for them and how can we give them the information in a way that makes sense to that audience. And I think that's priceless. And you're only going
yeah,
to learn that by, reaching out a little bit and volunteering
right,
to help them with certain things.
yeah, I love it. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Morales. We really appreciate you taking the time on this, and hopefully looking forward to having you again on into the future. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ian. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.